Outstanding. Thanks very much, Bob. Well, hi, everybody. So happy to be with you for the next hour or so. I guess I've tailored this for an hour, but want you to know that as we go through this material on Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, that any questions, comments, concerns you have, as Vaibhav said, the raise hand feature, and Vaibhav, if you would, because tonight I'm working with only one monitor, so all I can see is my screen share. If you see a raised hand, please feel free to stop me so we can address those questions, okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to learn about Azure AD PIM. How have I structured this presentation for us? Well, we're going to start by understanding the why. Why should we care about Azure AD PIM? What pain points or problems does PIM solve? Once we've established that, we're going to take a look at two areas, well, really three areas of core functionality in the product. One is called just-in-time role activation. What's great about that is that you can have your colleagues running at a lower level of privilege throughout Azure, and then if and only if they need to elevate their privileges, they can request that, optionally go through an approval workflow, and then have the elevated privileges only for a time-boxed time period. So basically, we're talking about least privilege authorization in action. The other thing we'll cover is access reviews. I think tonight's going to be a lot about themes. As an instructor, I really want to make sure that you leave this session not just with some of the, the elevator pitch details about Azure AD PIM and some skills, which I certainly hope you'll have some practical skills more than you do now in this service. But I also want to make sure you have a nice holistic picture in terms of just where this product fits, where Microsoft envisions its customers using the service. And I've been a Microsoft certification specialist for a long time. This service is appearing more and more across the different Azure certification exams. So it's kind of hard to avoid it nowadays. I'll finish with a few learning resources as well. And you might be wondering, am I going to share this slide deck? Yeah, absolutely, of course. What you can do is point your browser to timw.info/pim1. Now, if you're using a work computer, I know some corporate firewalls don't like short links. I don't have a workaround at the moment. But this short link will give you a direct download of my slide deck in PDF format. Okay, so that's timw.info/pim1. I also have a PowerShell script file that I'm happy to share it with you, but I'm going to tell you where I got the code so you could just go directly to the source when that time comes. Okay, so starting with the what and the why, understanding the Azure AD PIM use case. Let's take a look from a real-world perspective. How many times, especially now over the last year or so, do you see in your Google News feed or wherever you're getting your news something like this? The attack took advantage of forgotten about high-privileged Azure AD accounts. Privilege escalation due to people running at a higher privilege than they really should, accounts that are orphaned, or maybe people who move to different parts of your organization and who retain high-privilege role assignments. These sorts of problems increase your business's attack surface, don't they? And then this is something that can give you some sweats, it seems to me. I need a report of all the high-privileged role holders, especially any orphaned ones now, your corporate compliance officer. Yeah, that's not a good email or phone call to receive first thing in the morning on a Monday, is it? Okay, so in terms of setting the stage, we're talking about authorization. You know, with information security, we often talk about the AAA model. AAA, the first A being authentication or identity verification. Is this person or process, are they legitimate, right? Once the authentication process is successful, then authorization kicks in, and this is role-based access control in Azure. And as you can see on this slide, the theme here is that we've got two independent authorization streams in Azure. Let me see if I can get my drawing tools working. When I'm at home, I'm on a Mac, so I'm quite clumsy when I present on a Mac. I'll do my best, though. Let's see. Will my keyboard shortcuts work? No. Okay. Well, let's. I'll just give this a try or two. Let me minimize that. I'll use my mouse pointer. How's that? On the left side of the screen, we've got our Azure Active Directory authorization stream, and we've got a collection of built-in roles. The roles are aligned to job tasks. A role is simply a collection of operations. You know, you might have heard the acronym CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. Can a user register an application in Azure AD? Can a user reset somebody else's password? You know, these sorts of things. And the Azure resource side, where your subscriptions, your management groups, your resource groups, and your resources live, again, we've got a collection of built-in roles. Now, the ability to create custom roles is much more mature. And again, if you know some of this or all of this, I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence. I'm just trying to be as complete of a presenter as possible. The custom role experience is quite mature indeed on the Azure resource side, but very immature. If you've played around with custom roles in Azure AD, I just have no clue what's going on at Microsoft. They seem to have forgotten it. It's kind of in a proof of concept stage, and it has been for well over a year. It's pretty annoying. Lastly, you notice in parentheses, I'm outlining that in these two streams, on the identity side, we've got the Microsoft Graph Application Programming Interface, or API. And on the Azure Resource side, we have the Azure Resource Manager API. The theme here is that these are separate APIs and that are run by separate engineering teams. Why is that? Doesn't Azure use Azure AD as its identity store? Yes, however, we have to remember that Azure Active Directory is the Microsoft Cloud Platform identity. So it's used in Dynamics 365 and Microsoft 365 as well. So that's why you see some disparity. And initially, Azure AD Pim showed some disparity as well when you're going down the different streams here, resources and Azure AD. I think the engineering team who works on that product has gotten better to bring the user experience more consistent. But you'll see, because I plan to demo all this as we go on. I got to step it up a little bit. Now, here's some neat factual information about Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. This is an Azure AD Premium P2 feature, okay? Or if you're using Enterprise Mobility and Security, EMS E5. So it's it requires the most expensive license to use. However, this is important. Not every one of your users necessarily needs the Premium P2 or the EMS E5 license. From what Microsoft says, it's only going to be the users who are working in PIM. That is, if they're an approver, if they're a reviewer, or if they're configured for role activation, then they need a P2 license. But if users are not being managed or using PIM features, supposedly according to Microsoft, you don't need that license. We can say that PIM is a full RBAC, role-based access control, lifecycle management solution. Another theme. Microsoft, I think, intends teams to use this as your full base of operations for all of your RBAC assignments and management. In fact, once you turn on PIM and start using it, the PIM administrators will start to get emails whenever there are role assignments made outside of PIM. It's called the consent process. When you flip that master switch to turn on PIM, it's kind of like you're getting a tattoo. You're tattooing your Azure Active Directory, changes the user interface, and it's a one-way, non-reversible operation, okay? So key features, I've already mentioned some of this stuff. You're going to see as we configure the PIM service and configure role behavior in PIM, there's a lot of auditing. In fact, everything you do is audited in there. But justification is something that you can optionally enable. So you wind up over time, your life cycle, as you're working with built-in and custom roles, having a trail of not just the operations, but the reasons why these operations have taken place. It's pretty sweet, okay? All right, consent, what is this? Well, PIM let me try again. PIM initially, there you go, in your Azure subscription is there, but you have to consent to service. The image I have in my mind is flipping a big old switch, one of those big heavy switches. You have to be a highest privileged role holder to consent to PIM. In other words, in Azure AD, you have to be assigned the global administrator role. You have to have that P2 license. When you turn on PIM, it's clicking a button and then completing an Azure MFA challenge. Once you do that, as I mentioned, the UI, especially in Azure AD, changes pretty dramatically, such that when you're doing role assignments, you'll see all this stuff about eligibility and timing these assignments, where you can only give somebody an assignment for a time windowed period. You're like, what happened here? Is this some public preview feature? No, it's not. It's part of PIM, and it's part of Microsoft once you turn on PIM, kind of forcing you to do all of your RBAC work from within the context of PIM, okay? Lastly, you should be aware of the built-in role, privileged role administrator. Now that role gets created when you consent to PIM, and that's the role you want to keep in mind for delegation. Initially, it's just the one global administrator who consents to PIM that becomes the de facto PIM administrator. When you want to onboard assistants to also manage privileged identity management, you can give them, I would give them assignment to role administrator and security administrator. And there you go. So those are some of the facts. Now let's do our first demo. Let me switch over to my browser and let me zoom in here quite a bit. Oh, I don't want magnifier. No, I don't want that. Try another key. Clumsy, clumsy, clumsy. There we go. Good. All right, so here I am in the portal. Now I do happen to be a global administrator, so I'm not going to run into, or a privileged role administrator, so I'm not going to run into any access problems with PIM. I'm going to do a search here for PIM in the global search, and we can hop on over to Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. The quick start is where you'll see the consent to PIM control. Once you do that, it's a one and done operation. Once you consent to PIM, then forevermore, I don't know of any way to reverse it. Maybe there is a way if you file a support ticket, but my operational understanding is it's an irreversible one-way process. We now have the Pim interface. And what I want you to think about here from a theme perspective is that your Pim administrators are going to work in here. Potentially your compliance and security officers are going to work in here, but also your teammates, that is infrastructure people, developers, architects, will be in here as well. Because once you start centralizing all of your RBAC and PIM, there's a lot of self-service built into the console. Let me explain what I mean. As you can see on the left navigation, the top piece here, tasks, this is the self-service area. So the currently signed in user can dip in here to look at their role assignments. And as you see, those two authorization streams for Azure AD as well as Azure Resources. Excuse me, there's a public preview feature called privileged access groups that I'm not going to cover because we know the deal with public preview features. Unless otherwise instructed by Microsoft, public preview features are neither covered by an SLA, service level agreement, nor are they covered by Azure support. But as you can see here, sorry about that, got something going on in my throat. When we look at our role assignments, it's broken into eligible and active. And you can see that my current user here has the highest level global administrator as a direct assignment here, a permanent assignment. This is the way all of your RBAC assignments show up initially, because part of the paradigm shift of using PIM is that you and your team are going to regularly review these role assignments. And instead of just de facto giving somebody a permanent assignment, you're going to think, number one, does this person really need to be assigned this role permanently? If not, let's do eligible. Number two, is this a permanent thing, or do we want that eligibility or direct assignment to time out and expire? So again, paradigm shift time. It puts you into a recurring pattern, hopefully a habit, of revisiting and reevaluating these role assignments, all right? Now, if I come back to the self-service console, there's a couple options here. The My Request is used for the just-in-time role activation feature that we'll take a look at next. And then the other two options are for access reviews. Well, actually, the Approve requests is if you're designated as a PIM approver, and the review access is for the access reviews. Okay, so that's the self-service, and this is going to be where your non-PIM administrators spend their time. PIM administrators and those who are responsible for actually analyzing role assignments and making role assignments, you're going to be spending time down here under Manage. And again, we've got those two streams, Azure AD and Azure Resources. In this demo, let's say that we want to protect. First, we want to audit and then protect the contributors built-in group. You might know that whereas on Azure AD, the highest privileged role is Global Administrator, on the Azure Resources side, Owner is the highest privileged built-in role. Second in command, though, is that contributor role. And I find in the real world that gets handed out a bit too often for my curmudgeonly taste, because really, contributor is so similar to owner. There are a few things contributor can't do. Contributor can't work with resource locks. What else? A contributor can't modify role assignments. That's a big one. I think there's at least one other thing that I'm forgetting about that contributors can't do. It's a pretty high privilege role, though. So what we'll do is we'll come under Manage, Azure Resources. And the first step, when you first come in here to your Azure Resources in PIM as an administrator, when you first consent, you onboard your subscriptions one at a time. That's what this Discover Resources is up here. And once you've onboarded it, again, I think that's a one-time irreversible operation, then you've got access to it. So I just have my one subscription here. And if I dip into it, again, I've got a self-service area, but what I want to pay attention to now is the middle area down here. So here we're looking at our overall subscription, and as you can see, there's lots of these visualizations here where you can see at a glance, has anybody requested a role activation in the last 7 days? What is the distribution right now? You want to see this change from instead mostly permanent active assignments. You'd want that really to reverse to where most of the people who are on your access lists or assignment lists are eligible instead of permanent. And again, I haven't formally defined that yet, but we're getting there shortly. Now, as far as auditing and reporting on these role memberships, you can look at it from the lens of the role, or you can look at it from the lens of the user. That's the roles and assignments. And although in my demo, I'm only going to do the Azure Resources side, it works basically the same way if you're going down the Azure AD side. So we can do all this same stuff on the Azure AD side of the fence as well. So here under roles, we were looking for contributors. So let's just search the list. This list will show not only built-in roles, but custom ones that you've created as well. Let me come down to contributor. And we can see at a glance here, there's 13, what's that row? Active, eligible. It looks like there's 13 active and then 0 that are marked as eligible. So that's not good. We definitely want to adjust that. So let's come in here as a PIM administrator and head on over to active assignments. So our first order of business here, and you can do this in the context of an access review with your teammates, or you can come in and go it solo like I am right now as a PIM administrator. So you can see we can go down the list here and see users, groups, and service principals that are given these permanent assignments. So these are all subscription scope assignments. So we need to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Like Rochester users, Buffalo Cloud users, let's say that the Rochester user group has been disbanded or something, so it's no longer necessary. How can we make a change here? Well, pretty easily, as a matter of fact. Let me select that row, or just come over where the row is down here. We've got remove and update, so we can just dump them right now with minimal muss, fuss, or greasy aftertaste, as I like to say. So I can just start to dump some of these assignments, and these changes are going to go into effect immediately. So we would spend our time doing that. That's fine. Now, what about this eligibility? See this Aaron Wood fictional user I have right here? Let's say that Aaron is, let's say that he's a developer. But sometimes, on occasion, he needs to create resources for himself in your subscription. And it could be at the subscription scope like we're doing here, or it could be at the resource group scope. Let's say that we would want to do it here at the subscription scope. But instead of having him always be a contributor, we want him to run at a lower level of privilege as a baseline, but we want to make him eligible to boost his permission. So let's see, what might we want to do? I'm going to be kind of dramatic here, but why don't we, first let me dump out of some of these other groups, because Aaron may be a member of some groups and I don't want to cause complexity. One thing to keep in mind with Azure RBAC is that when you've got multiple permissions combining, it's like they're all in a single bucket, and the user's effective permission is whatever the most powerful of those are. So I don't want to mess myself up here. So I think Manoa group, there's one more Azure AD group assignment. Let me get rid of that one just to try to clear that out. And why don't we make another assignment? I know in the real world you'll be working with groups and not users. I understand these things, but I'm just rolling here with the demo. Let's make an assignment directly from Pim. And let's say that Aaron's baseline permission at the subscription scope is reader. And I know that's way too strict. Just I'm doing it because I can. How's that? So here, let's see here. We've got select role, contributor. No, we're in the wrong role. Sorry about that. I had a little brain problem there for a minute. We're going to have to make the assignment in another group if we're going to do it in Pim, because we're looking in this context only at the contributor group. Okay, don't forget, Tim. We'll do it after this. So if we're going to make Aaron a reader, say, at the subscription level, so he can look but not touch our Azure resources, but if he does need, for instance, to create an app service app or a function app, we want him to be able to request that elevation. That is the eligibility, see? So watch this. We can go on Aaron's row, and instead of removing him from the list, we'll hit update instead. All right, so for our assignment type here, instead of active, we're going to make him eligible. Now, what the net effect of this is that unless Aaron has, maybe a management group level grant, I don't know if that's the case, but he's not going to have contributor anymore. When you change the permission to eligible, or if you just give somebody an eligibility out of the box, we could do a fresh assignment for another user or group right here, and we could specify that they're eligible right out of the gate. I'm just making a change to an existing assignment. They lose the permanent. Aaron's no longer a contributor, effective immediately, but he'll be eligible to boost that permission. So we changed that, and then notice here we changed the assignment here. It says the maximum allowed eligible duration is 15 days. So this is part of that theme of recurring, revisiting these role memberships. Microsoft really, in a way, corrals you or almost kind of forces you into that. Now, again, before we leave contributor, I want to show you how you as a Pim administrator can customize the behavior of this role. For example, when Aaron goes to activate, when he does his request, do you want Azure to just immediately approve that and process the activation? Or do you need to have a manual intervention of an approver? Now, of course, be careful with an approver, because if you have only one approver and they're on vacation or on sick leave, you're going to be in trouble potentially. But what you do there is per role, you come into settings here. And in the role settings, we'll hit edit so we can get access to those settings. Look at the things that we can do here. We can change how long an activation is allowed. Looks like right now I have it set to 1 hour. We can go from 30 minutes all the way to 24 hours. Now the user can cut down on that time themselves if they want to be a good citizen in Azure, but as a Pim administrator, you adjust that default maximum duration. Notice that we've got integration with Azure multi-factor authentication to make sure that the user requesting that activation is who they claim to be. Now I'm going to turn that off just so I don't have to mess with that second step. But you should know that Azure MFA is an option you can turn on throughout all of Pim. Here's some options for that justification that I was talking about. And then if you're going to do approval, you'll need to require approval. and then you'll need to select at least one approver. It looks like I'm already marked as an approver here, so it looks like that's fine. Let's click next.
Hey, Tim.
Yes, sir.
One of the question is, can there be an approver group? So since you added yourself, you can also add a group there to approve.
Yeah, as you can see in the user interface here, I've got 1 member, 0 group. Great question. Yeah, in the real world, I would recommend that you aggregate approvers into 1 or more groups and then specify the group rather than individual. Yeah, great point. Are you going to allow permanent eligible assignment? And what is this is where the 15 days in my case comes from. It looks like you can cut that. You can bring that up to a year, it looks like. So this would just depend upon your tolerance in terms of how often you want to revisit those. Let's see, expire active assignments, pretty self-explanatory. I don't want to just sit here reading the interface to you. Now, as a PIM administrator, you may find that by default, PIM is pretty chatty. You'll start to get a lot of emails. An assignment was made outside of PIM, and it can almost be that classic problem of growing numb to the alerts. So you do have some control over these notifications. But when you think about that, this UI that you're looking at applies to every role, wow, that is potentially a lot of email traffic. So, a pro tip might be to configure your email client to sort and categorize the different type of PIM alerts and notifications you can get. All right, let me hit update, and that will complete that configuration change. Lastly, I want to just give Aaron an assignment of reader. And here I'm going to actually go outside of PIM. And let's just go the way that Microsoft doesn't want us to do it anymore. And I know this will trigger email to my Tim@TimW account saying an assignment was made outside of PIM, just to show that you can still use the classic access control IAM controls, even though we're supposed to be using PIM. So I'm going to add a role assignment here. And the UI here I've noticed has changed just in the last week or so. I'm going to do reader, and I'm going to do Aaron, who's right at the top of my list. And then we're going to go next. Now again, this speaks to the theme I mentioned, that Azure Resource Manager API and Microsoft Graph API are run by different people. And when you've got 2 development teams who may or may not communicate well with each other, you can wind up with some disparities. Remember, I mentioned that once you start using PIM, it tattoos the Azure AD. But you notice that here on the Azure Resource side, it doesn't appear to be doing that, actually. And if we look up Aaron on our access list, let's see what happens. If we do Aaron let's do a report here. See, it's just showing his permanent assignment here. So it looks like on the Azure Resource side, it hasn't yet, in my opinion, reached full integration with PIM. But you'll find if we do go to Azure Active Directory, and we were to come down, say, to roles and administrators, where we can get to our built-in and custom Azure AD roles, and we attempted to do an assignment here. It looks like we can't. We can do an assignment from within the role. See, eligible, active, so it's natively, the Azure AD side anyway, is natively plugged directly into PIM. Well, let's test this out. Let me go to a new in private window, and let's sign in to the portal as Aaron. I'll zoom it in once I'm signed in. Aaron@timw.info. Hopefully I'll remember the password. Okay, good. So now we're coming in as PIM, and you and I know that Aaron is just a reader, so he's not going to be able to deploy anything, but he could, he can read what's there. So if we go to resource groups, for example, we can see my resource groups. We're not going to be able to create anything. Now this is a training point for you and your team, that you'll need to train your team that when they need to do a privileged operation, they're going to need to get in the habit of going to the Pim console themselves up here in the self-service area where they can lodge a request. And how do they lodge the request? They go to My Roles. They go either through Azure AD roles or, as we'll do, Azure Resources. And here we can see that Aaron has that eligible assignment for contributor. So what he'll do is activate here, this link. And notice that by default, Azure assumes that the user wants to activate immediately. But let's say Aaron knows that their approvers are off on lunch or in a business meeting, or maybe Aaron needs to go to the dentist. You can schedule the activation into the future instead of have it be now. I mentioned that the Pim administrator sets the maximum duration, but Aaron could say, you know, I'm only going to need a half hour or an hour here. And then if you've got justification turned on, notice the asterisk. This is a required field. I need to create a storage account for my project. And again, all this is reportable from within the Pim console. Now, what happens now depends upon whether you've configured approval. If you don't do approval, then Azure approves the request and the user's off and running within maybe 10, 15 seconds. But in this case, that's not the case. What did the notification say? Your request is pending for approval. So it's in a stuck state. Now, at this point, any configured approvers will receive email. You've got an outstanding approval request. Aaron himself here can go back to the Pim console, and this time he can go to My Requests. He can go to Azure Resources, and he can see here his reason, and he can see when he lodged the request and what its status is, and he can cancel the request if he wants to. Now, from the approver standpoint, let's go back to my session. I can come to the Pim console, and I will go to Approve Requests for Azure Resources. Sometimes the UI takes a little bit to catch up, I've noticed. We can see requests for role activations. Here it is. And we can, again, read his justification here. And we can simply select and either approve or deny. I'm going to approve, of course. And notice here, you can have optionally justification required for the approver. What am I going to say? Aaron needs to create that dadgum storage account. Okay, so I'm going to confirm that justification. Now, what used to be the case is that the user would have to sign out and sign back into the portal, but that's no longer the case. We should find that the portal will auto-refresh if it hasn't already done so. Actually, let me just force a refresh here. And if we come back to the Pim console, is there a question?
Yeah, a couple of things. So Tim says they have to have the role assigned to them before they can lodge a request, which is correct. They have to have that assignment done beforehand. And Chris is asking, can you prevent approvers from approving themselves, making it so someone else has to approve? So the question is, can the approvers approve themselves? If I'm an approver and I go and elevate my permissions, can I approve my own request? Or
Right.
is there a way to prevent that?
Nothing obvious. Like, for instance, I know in Azure DevOps, there's that ability to prevent people from approving their own pull requests. But here in Pim, I think the trust model is such that I haven't tested it. So I guess the short answer is I don't know. But nothing stands out as a feature that I can immediately think of that would prevent an approver from approving their own requests. I'm thinking the trust model is such that if you're an approver, I don't know. Sorry about that vague answer. So this is our
I've also not seen that. So my assumption is an approver should be able to approve it because of the trust.
Yep, I agree. All right, so now as Aaron, if we go to My Roles, let me actually step back. So from the Pim console root here, if we go to Tasks, My Roles, and then we go to Azure Resources, we're going to see if we go to Active Assignments, notice we've got the permanent direct assignment of Reader, but we also now have our eligible one. And notice that whereas the Reader we made from outside of Pim is permanent, this one is going to expire in an hour. So at this point, now that Aaron has Contributor, he can create that storage account and either let the time out, or he can be a good citizen and he can deactivate. That would be a training issue, to train your people when they finish their high privilege action. They don't have to, but it would be really nice if they come in here and they deactivate. This again is in keeping with the principle of least privilege authorization, such that the user is running at their baseline, the minimum set of permissions that they need in order to do their work successfully. All right, so that is just-in-time role activation in a nutshell. Let's come back to the slide deck here.
Hey, Tim, does all these requests get logged somewhere? All the application requests?
Yeah. You know something, it seems to me, let me open up another browser tab, go into the portal again in another tab. Because it seems to me we should be able to get to the Pim operations from Azure Monitor and the activity log, given that activity log tracks every, well, although that's not the case, that's ARM, isn't it, not Azure AD. Yeah, never mind. Let me go back to my original answer to your question. Okay, so whereas so far in the Pim console, we saw that we've got the self-service, then you've got the configuration. And then within the configuration, there's some auditing that I'll show you. And then down here, this My Audit History allows you to, why isn't it showing me anything yet? Oh, I have to go and take a look down a particular stream. Here we go. So if we go into My Audit History, go to Resources, this shows everything that you as a currently logged on user have done and any associated people that might be affected. So we can see the most recent options in this log are that I made Aaron eligible for role activation, and then Aaron actually initiated that request. And so we can follow our own audit trail, and you can export these reports as they come down, it looks like as a comma separated value or CSV file. So this is just some of the built-in auditing and reporting. Now, if you wanted to extend this, what I would have you think about is either Azure Sentinel, if you're familiar with that, or just log analytics. Seeing how you can get as much Azure AD and Pim data in that data warehouse. Because the auditing that's in the Pim console itself, I mean, you saw it, it's relatively straightforward and you can pull CSVs, but that's about it. If you're familiar with log analytics and Azure Sentinel, which is a security platform built on top of log analytics, there you can get a much richer experience in terms of querying and reporting and creating alerts and that kind of stuff. Now, if we go down into Manage Azure Resources, and we come back to where we were a moment ago when we were looking at a particular role. Let's just take a quick look here. So we've got under Manage here for the subscription, we've got assignments, alerts, and we've got some resource auditing stuff down here. This is going to show any alerts that were fired. And then if we go under Activity Resource Audit, looks like this is showing everybody's actions. So the interface here is very similar to the activity log, actually, if you're familiar with it in Azure Monitor, in terms of we can adjust the time span, we can look at specific types of operations. Let's see, subject type, members, groups, and then we can, once we've modeled our data, we can pull it down as a CSV file. And then lastly, if we go into, again, roles where we were originally, if we go to contributor, let's see here, yeah. What's this showing us? No, that's just where we're going to modify assignments. Okay, now I think we've already done just-in-time role activation, so this is just an extra slide. Users made eligible to activate a role. The user initiates that request. Optionally, you've got an approval workflow. Then the user receives a time-windowed role elevation. After the time window closes, the user goes back to their original access level. Yeah, so we've done all that already. Now, what's this about access reviews? This, again, speaks to that theme of regular, recurring analysis of your role assignments with goals like preventing orphan assignments, where a user is still carrying a high privilege assignment that they don't need for their job anymore. Helping you and your teammates evaluate, yeah, this person is still a colleague, but they don't need a membership in this role. Or they do, and they should be permanently associated with this role, or they should be eligible. So these sorts of things. It's a way to capture all of that in a single interface. And so here's a screenshot of what the Access Review UI looks like in the portal, where each reviewer is looking at a particular role, and they're seeing the folks who are actually in the role right now, and you're essentially deciding one by one whether you approve or deny that user being in the role. And again, we've got the ability to customize these access reviews to require a reason, so you wind up capturing that metadata as well. So let's take a look at the role activation, the access review process next. We'll go back to the Privileged Identity Management console, and under Manage, let's go back to Azure Resources and to our subscription. And let's say we want to do an access review of the contributors group, just like we did before. We can go back to roles. Contributor. And let's see, is this going to allow us to do it? Let me quickly see. Yeah, it will. Okay, so it looks like once you're in the role and looking at its metadata, you can trigger an access review from there. Another thing you can do actually from the subscription screen that we're on right now is under Manage, there's a dedicated access reviews blade where you can see all history of current and past access review operations. Will it allow us to download these? So we can look way back, it looks like on August 26, I did a contributor role review, and we can take a look at the details of that operation. It's going to show us the results, how many users were reviewed. It looks like in this run, 3 were denied membership or assignment to the contributors role, and 1 was approved. Of course, we can see all the metadata that accompanies the review. We can see who else was involved in the review, because this was a self-review, so it was just me. And then we can look at our settings. What I'm not seeing here, maybe audit logs. I was wondering how we could pull a file of this information. It's not what I want, because I mean, it's all well and good to look at a GUI, but if you've got a lot of these to look at, I don't know, something to think about. So anyway, let's come back to our access review screen and let's create one. This is actually a subject, if you're a certification candidate, I find on the AZ500, which is the Azure Security Engineer exam, they really go all out asking about access reviews. You really have to know quite a bit of details about this in particular in Pim. So let's click New to create a new access review. Now, we're going to do this on a per role basis. So you as a Pim administrator, if you're going to set up an access review process, this will be a repetitive thing. Because although this UI allows us to choose more than one role, a separate access review is going to be created for each role. It's a one-to-one correspondence, access review to role, access review to role. And I think that makes sense logically. So let's call this Omaha Contributors Review. We set a start date, and you can have this just be a one-off review, or you can have it, as you can see here, you can do it on a recurring basis. Duration, how many days do you want the review to be spread over? Because especially if you're doing a team-based review, you want to give your colleagues time to do the work, to find their email where they were invited to the review and actually do the work. There is a prompt to remind users to kind of say, hey, here's another notification to complete your review here. So we specify our frequency, duration, our end date. The user scope is going to be, what are you evaluating? This is really just going to be users and groups. But notice that in public preview, Microsoft is going to grant us the ability to do access reviews on service principals. And if you don't know what a service principal is in Azure, it's basically a service account. It can represent an Azure AD application. It can represent just an identity that you're attaching privileges to. And that's kind of cool that that's going to be baked into here eventually. But we'll just stay with users and groups for now. What is the specific role that we're going to do the access review for? So we'll select a role, look up contributor. Now again, this UI is allowing us to choose more than one if we want to, but Azure will create a separate access review for each one if we do a multi-select. What type of review is this? There's selected users. This is going to be for a team-based review. Assigned self is going to be where the user sets up an access review just for themselves to do, and they want to make sure that that process is audited and tracked and recorded in Pim. And manager, honestly, I'm not totally familiar with. I haven't tried that one. I think that hinges on if you're using the manager property in Azure AD, where a manager can review role memberships. I need to make a note to self to dive into that more. I just have used the top two options. So let's do a team-based review in which our reviewers are going to be our friend Aaron and myself. Why would I invite Aaron to this review? Well, although Aaron may not be a Pim administrator, Aaron may be asked here, take a look. Do you still need access to contributor? And Aaron can see that he's been made eligible and can think about and basically approve or deny himself assignment into that role. And then lastly, you set up your behavior surrounding the access review. And the main one here that I want to draw your attention to is auto apply. When you turn on auto apply, what happens is when the access review owner stops the review or when the review reaches the end of its duration, do you want the results, the net results of either stay in the role or be booted out of the role to be put into action or not? Simple as that. It's a way to put a little bit of automation here into it. If we do disable, then it would be a manual process where the Pim administrator or the access review administrator would then need to manually go and remove the appropriate accounts from those role assignments. You can specify what happens if a reviewer doesn't respond in time by the time the review is closed. Again, I don't need to read these. And then under advanced settings, you can do making sure that mail notifications are enabled, require reason. The recommendations piece is pretty low tech. You'd think with all the AI that Microsoft has access to, it would be a bit more robust. Essentially, what recommendations does is Azure will look and report on when the last time the user used the role, and if the user hasn't signed in or done anything with the role in the last 30 days, Azure will generally recommend that they be removed from the role. So it's better than nothing. Let me click Start. Normally it takes a couple minutes for this to kick in and show up in the interface, but we should expect to find within a few moments that if we go again back to the Pim console, we then can look in our self-service. And Aaron, this should also work for Aaron because he's been invited to an access review. And if we go down the Azure Resources stream under Review Access, nope, it's not showing up yet, but in time, we'll see an entry here for our Omaha contributor review, and we can click in there and complete said review. For grins, let me go over to Aaron's session. And let's go to the root of the PIM console, and let's go to Review Access, Azure Resources. There it is. Good. All right, so Aaron has decided, okay, I'm going to complete my review now, so let's do this. Let's get this party started. So we can head on into the interface. Eventually, it'll enumerate all of the assignees. Okay, can require reason on approval is true. Okay, good. So it looks like we've got 3 people here, Aaron, Eric, and Greg. And Aaron is going to decide on all 3 of those. For himself, I still need to create Azure resources for my job. Approve. Now again, this doesn't make an action happen in Azure. This simply logs the user's results. And then when the Access Review Administrator stops the review, they can use this as input to decide who stays and who goes in the role. Eric Smith. Now notice here that the recommended action for both of these is to deny because they signed in more than 30 days ago. I'll say Eric's services are no longer required. So we're going to deny Eric. And then for Greg, lastly, Greg, whoops. Come on now. There we go. Greg moved to a different team. And we're going to deny Greg. See? So once that's finished, the user is finished with their review and they can go about their merry way. And then on the other side of things, the Access Review Administrator, yeah, I said that correctly, we can go back to the Access Reviews area to see the overall progress of the review. Let's see just for grins, first of all, if our review shows up in the UI yet. Let's go to Azure Resources. Yep, good. So it finally showed up. I'm actually not going to complete my review because I want to go to the Access Review Global page so you can see what that looks like. So let's go under Manage Azure Resources again. Go into our subscription. And this time, let's come down to Access Reviews. And we've got our Omaha Contributors Review right here, and I am the owner, and it started tonight. Its status is active. Right, so let's select it. And you saw this interface a little while ago when we looked at a past review. We can see our users, what the results are so far. We can review the reviewers. A little bit syrupy, like I mentioned before. Now, what can we do here? Remove. Okay, I was hoping there would be a remind. There it is. Yeah. Remember I mentioned that in a team-based review, some people like me practice inbox 0. Other people don't. So the PIM messages are going to go to the bottom of the pile. You can remind the selected user. We can add additional reviewers to the queue. And then what was settings again? Is where we can change our options like auto apply and all of that metadata. But really it comes down to seeing what people are voting, what people are thinking about thus far. And then from an Access Review Administrator standpoint, like I said, the 2 ways that you can end the review is 1, just to let the Access Review period time out. Number 2, the PIM administrator would decide to stop the review. So as you can see, there's stop and reset. Reset means that it starts it over from scratch again. Stop means we're not going to review anymore. And at this point, do you want to stop the review? Reviewers will no longer be able to give responses. Yes. Depending upon whether you're doing auto apply would immediately make changes to role membership. Otherwise, you can manually apply those results. Or you could just do it manually by looking at your results info and then I guess doing the work manually. Now, if you're thinking about that there's a lot of clicky, there's a lot of graphical user interface stuff, that's absolutely the case. You might be wondering, can we programmatically get to Azure Active Directory PIM? And the answer to that is yes, we can. I'm not sure about Azure Command Line Interface or CLI, but I know that PowerShell is supported for Azure AD PIM. And you can do most stuff in PIM now programmatically, which is pretty cool. Now, the catch to that is that the Azure AD PIM commandlets are not in the generally available Azure AD PowerShell module. You need to get the public preview one. So if you've done an install module Azure AD, that's fine. That's going to be your GA commands. You'll want to load in the Azure AD preview. And again, if you want to get this source code, I would point your browser here on line 4. If you go to timw.info/K4Z, that's where I got some sample code. Somebody posted some sample code on some simple operations with PIM using that Azure AD PIM module that's baked into the Azure AD Premium or Azure AD Preview module. Now, from a theme perspective, remember again that Azure AD is separate from ARM. That's why the PowerShell modules are separate. We would do an install module named AZ to install the ARM modules. We need to separately install the Azure AD Preview to get to our Azure AD commands. So just like we do connect AZ account to sign into Azure on the ARM side, you do a connect Azure AD to sign into Azure AD programmatically. And then the rest of this, I just want to point out that it's like any other garden variety PowerShell. So in this first example here, as you can see on the comment on line 6, shows you how to do an Azure AD role assignment. I think this is going to do eligible, yeah. So basically, what does it have us doing? We're creating some variables. We're going to need our Azure Active Directory tenant ID. We'll store role names as variables. Then we're going to need to get the GUID of the role definition. And unfortunately, working with Azure AD users with PowerShell is a little bit annoying because you need the object ID property. It's not as easy as just using their sign-in name. So as you can see, there's some PowerShell shorthand going on line 12, where we're fetching the object ID of a given user, where we know their sign-in name, but we don't yet know their object ID. And then it looks like we're creating some variables to determine our eligibility parameters. In other words, start time and end time and that kind of stuff. And then to actually do the eligibility assignment here, this is one of the longest PowerShell commands I think I've ever seen in my life. Open Azure ADMS privileged role assignment request. Say that 3 times quickly, I defy you. I'm glad for tab completion, wow. But anyway, notice that we're just plugging in those various IDs, unfortunately, it's kind of ugly. And then we're making this assignment eligible according to the schedule object that we've created up earlier. So anyway, that's just what this is. It's just some proof of concept PowerShell code. The main things I want you to take away again are the fact that you need to get the Azure AD Preview module, sign into Azure AD separately, and then again, it's basically intermediate level garden variety PowerShell from there to automate your PIM work. Questions, comments, concerns, curiosities?
There are few actually. So
okay.
Michael points out saying reviewers need to have security reader and global reader permissions to see the details in the reports. And looks like he was working with Microsoft on that today. He spent 45 minutes with Microsoft today to figure that out. I think that's good to know. Mike is asking about Microsoft 365, how some of these roles span across M365 and Azure. So even though we can have global administrator role under PIM in Azure, you can still go ahead and assign them directly in M365. So his question is, can you speak to why Azure AD RBAC roles governed by PIM be permanently assigned in the M365 admin portals? which in essence circumvents Azure PIM eligible assignments, maximum duration, and approval requirements. And he also adds, is it due to Azure and M365 management planes differing?
Well, it's been a long time since I've done an assignment in the M365 portal, but remember what I mentioned earlier, that Azure AD is used across the Microsoft Cloud Platform. So I would expect if you're using Microsoft 365 with your Azure AD tenant, Azure AD PIM is an Azure AD feature. If you're asking if the UI, if the assignment UI reflects PIM in the Microsoft 365 portal, I actually don't know. I'm going to quickly check that right now. Let me see. Yeah, it's the same users, because as you can see, I've got M365 with my those licenses tied into my Azure tenant.
All right. So this is Mike. Let me clarify. I've said this several times, and it's a concern at work. A role that is subject to example for a maximum 1 year duration for assignment in PIM. If I go into the portal in the Microsoft 365 portal, I can take that role, assign it, and it becomes permanently assigned. And it shows up as permanently assigned in the Azure PIM.
Oh boy.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going like, what?
Yeah, that's ugly. That is
So I
ugly.
guess the screen you are on now, if you will click on Admin Center Access, if you assign Global Administrator, I think it makes a permanent assignment and it just ignores what we have configured in PIM.
Right.
Yeah, that's disappointing and ugly. And that just shows to me, I see that as different engineering teams doing the same thing generally, but through lack of communication.
I guess some feedback we should pass on to Microsoft. But it's a good
Yeah,
catch.
absolutely. The security team is livid about this.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I'll look into that more tonight. Thanks for surfacing that, because, gosh, I would think sometimes logic doesn't factor in, does it?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, last comment, Tim. The other Tim on the call is saying the script that you had, the partial script you were showing, you were using Connect Azure AD. So he was saying for some of the modules, you have to use Azure AD preview / Connect Azure AD. If you will use Connect Azure AD directly, it might not work. So you have to prefix Azure AD preview to Connect Azure AD.
Thank you.
Good call out.
I forgot about that. Yeah, that's why I hesitate to and try to do a side-by-side with Azure AD generally available and Azure AD preview, that question of colliding commands. What's the name of that switch again? That parameter, if I want to use the
just before Connect Azure AD commandlet, you have to prefix it with Azure AD preview / It's on the chat. If you do have chat open by any chance, but it says Azure AD preview. You have that in the install module, the name of the module that you have, just prefix it to the command.
Thank you for that. Good to know. Good to know. Yeah, I forgot about that. Now, as far as further learning resources, what do I have? I just found some low effort options here for you. If you're familiar with Microsoft Learn, that's Microsoft's free online learning portal. They've got a path called Manage Identity and Access. That's going to have training on PIM. Now, the problem with PIM and with Azure AD in a learning context is that it's really difficult to sandbox Azure AD. In fact, only one training company I'm aware of has been able to do it. If you've heard of A Cloud Guru, they were able to successfully sandbox Azure AD, but they don't have any PIM labs either. Nobody does. Even Microsoft hasn't been able to sandbox Azure AD. So we're talking about hopefully you've got an Azure Pass or a trial or something to work with on your own. I did a course at Pluralsight called Configuring Azure AD PIM. And then in the Microsoft docs, of course, the ultimate source of authority, there's a short link to the Azure AD PIM docs. Then in closing, I would submit that Azure AD PIM is going to require a paradigm shift for your whole team. And the focus is doing all of your RBAC assignments and management from there. Again, the session materials, timw.info/PIM1. My Pluralsight courses are at timw.info/PS. Twitter is TechTrainerTim. Web, timw.info or techtrainertim.com. Anything else, Bob?
No, I guess pretty good. If anyone has any question or comment, you can feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask them now.
Okay, this is Mike. Not a question, but I just posted something in the chat. That's a very good tool. I don't know if everyone knows about it, but it's basically an environment that you can use with up to 25 licenses. And as long as you keep active for, I think, every 30 days or up to 90 days, Microsoft lets you have that environment. And it has 25 licenses with, I think, Premium 2 licenses. So things like PIM, you can go in there and play around with. And
does it comes with Azure AD Premium P1?
Yes, 2. Yeah, if you look at it, you can check it out, the details in the link, which is pretty good. Now, you don't get the Azure subscriptions, of course, but you do get the Microsoft 365 subscription for up to 25 licenses. So I use it all the time for testing. You just got to keep active. As long as you keep active, they don't take it away. And of course, don't use it for production reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also utilize the license that comes as part of the Visual Studio subscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the enterprise ones have Azure AD Premium P2 license included. Okay, I got one more question for you, Tim. How would you use PIM to control access to a server such as a domain controller? I believe, Tim, you mean these domain controller when you say DC.
Well, I guess I would need more detail. Are you talking about control plane operations of the VM itself, start, restart, resize, or signing into the VM as a user?
Signing in.
Signing in. Well, one thing you can enable with both Windows and Linux VMs is Azure AD authentication. And in that case, there's built-in roles. They're called, what are they called? There's virtual machine administrator login and virtual machine login. There's a standard user login and an administrator login built-in role. And those will only work if you've configured the Azure VM for Azure AD authentication. But if you're willing to do that, those roles would give you a way to control who can sign in as an administrator or a standard user.
And can we assign Azure AD group to a VM? I never tried that. If not, I was going to privilege access groups feature. I found it to be very powerful. You can utilize PIM to assign members dynamically to a dynamic group. So similar to how you elevate your permissions to a role, you can elevate your membership to be a member of a role of a group. So by default, you will not be a member of the AD group, but whenever you want to be part of that group, you go and elevate your permissions, and it adds you to that group for that particular time.
I like that. That's elegant. Thanks for teaching me that.
It's elegant. I've used it for integrating it with AWS SSO. So what we did was we created a group and made that group as an administrator on AWS, and then everyone who can be administrator uses privileged access groups, and it just in time they go ahead and add themselves to the group and they get administrator access, and after the time expires, it's gone. So I'm not sure if that can happen with a virtual machine. If so, then that could be a possibility too.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis asked a question: how much of PIM do you think is going to be in AZ 303 or 304 and now 305?
Right. Not as much would be my initial point. Because, what Microsoft is doing over time is teasing apart the overlap. I'm sure you know upwards to 50% overlap historically among most of those core exams. So I would say much less. I'm sure it's going to show up there at least a little bit in terms of the number of questions you might see on Azure Architect. maybe 1 or 2. But I mean, Microsoft, I think for good reason, wants prospective and current Azure architects to be aware of PIM, because when you think about it, identity and access is the core of your whole platform in Azure.
Cool. Hey, thanks, Tim. I really appreciate that. And as a little off topic, I did take when I started my IT career, I did take your A+ course on Pluralsight, and it's really cool to learn about Azure from you and just talking to you live. And thanks for putting this together, the whole team. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Thank you. That's a blast from the past. I remember that A+ series. That was quite a beast. I don't know how many hours of training that was.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. If there is nothing else that anyone has, I would like to thank you, Tim, once again for taking time out today to present in the group. This session was awesome as always. So thank you once again, and we hope to keep seeing you again in the user group.